Thank you, Dr. Coven. Good morning, all. In just a moment, I will actually do the introduction to Dr. Cameron Carter, J. Cameron Carter, but before I do, I also wanted to make an announcement about an event that will happen this afternoon here on campus. We would like to invite those who are present here, as well as our faculty, students, and staff, to join here back again at 4 o'clock this afternoon in Santee Chapel for a safe space. There's a lot going on right now in our community and in our world, and one of the most important things that we can do is maintain kind of this equilibrium between theory and critical thought, care, and practice on the ground. So we want to offer a safe space for folk to be able to come and speak about where they're feeling, how they're feeling, and the tension that oftentimes arises in response to all that's happening related to race and violence and justice and injustice, while also trying to maintain community. So that will happen this afternoon here at 4 o'clock here in Santee Chapel. We invite you to come, be present, and create a safe space with us here at Lancaster Theological Seminary. Now to the business at hand. J. Cameron Carter is the Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Black Church Studies at Duke Divinity School. He teaches courses in theology and Black church studies. Working as a theologian, he addresses the basic areas of Christian thought, especially attending to Christology, which is the person and work of Jesus Christ, and theological anthropology, the human being in Christian perspective. But in engaging such matters, he does so with a view not just to the church or Christian believers, he does so with a view to the broader humanities, particularly with an eye towards such fields as cultural studies, gender studies, philosophy, and literature. His book, Race, A Theological Account, came out in 2008. It is published by Oxford University Press. The good news is that was, 6 years ago? He's got 2 more coming down the pipeline right now. His upcoming publications are The Color of Sovereignty, Poetic Blackness in the Wake of Political Theology, out also by Duke Press, and Post-Racial Blues, Religion and the 21st Century Color Line. We want to extend our welcome, and we appreciate your presence, Dr. J. Cameron Carter.
Okay. For now, though, so we can get started, I'm going to take this down. You see the title, which is a revised title from what I said I was going to present, but it still covers some of the material. I've sort of revised it and updated it and want to talk under the title about Bonhoeffer's failed blackness. Hopefully, in the course of the presentation, you'll see why failure is actually parenthetical. I sort of mean failure in a double sense, sort of has a double entendre about it. On the one hand, I'm interested in seeing how and talking through Bonhoeffer's relationship to blackness, but also sort of elaborating the complexity of that relationship, a complexity that on the one hand, one might say is a certain kind of success, but on the other hand, is also another kind of failure. And again, in the course of the presentation, I hope to make that clear. All right, I'm gonna pull this off for now so I can get started. And then when I need to get images, if they don't come up with the other computer, I'll just plug this back in and then put the images up, okay? Okay, fantastic. I stand before you today to deliver a lecture, or it's better perhaps that I term it a few remarks, about a man removed from us temporally by slightly under 3/4 of a century, spatially removed from us by oceanic distances and a continental divide. But even more, he is one whose I've set myself the task today of offering a few remarks about. And even as I do so, there's another thing, as it were, that separates him from me, at least, and maybe from some others in this audience too. And that is a racial divide. He is white. I am black. The man of whom I speak is theologian and slain Christian martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer. For at least 2 reasons, I cannot help but mention the divide of race in speaking of the man Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The first reason is that I deliver these comments, these reflections, the Swander lecture, quote unquote, in the wake of an epidemic of racial violence that, as I speak, is sweeping the nation and has it even now in a tailspin. I should say parenthetically, it kept me up late last night. It messed with me really bad, but I digress. Or maybe I don't digress. I continue. Our gathering this morning, therefore, is haunted. Ghosts are in our midst. Between you and me, between you and the one next to you, in the empty spaces separating your row from the one in front of you and behind you, in that space between me, this pulpit, this podium area, and you, my auditors, between the world and me, if I might purloin that phrase of writer Richard Wright, as he put it in a poem by this title, penned but only 5 years before Bonhoeffer's death. In the space between moves ghosts, moves the spirit of Eric Garner, a man who in New York City earlier this year was put in a chokehold by New York City police officers and strangled to death. With his waning breaths, as he gasped almost asthmatically for air, you can hear him crying, "I can't breathe." He leaves a wife and a community, in effect, chanting a liturgy of these words along with him in the wake. We can't breathe either. Even as a grand jury, yet again, failed to indict the officers who strangled Garner to death. I'm good. Between you and you and me, between we and us, roams and moves the ghosts of Michael Brown, who in August of this year, this summer, was shot dead by a police officer, Darren Wilson, as Brown and his friend were ambulating, walking down the middle of the street. A couple of weeks ago, a couple of weeks away from going to college, Brown found himself in the middle of the street, not walking anymore, but dead, left for 4.5 hours or so, like an animal. We are told by a preponderance of witnesses that Brown was shot with his hands up, igniting protests with another chant, "Hands up, don't shoot." To be sure, there was a lot of evidence that needed to be sorted through, from a legal point of view at least, in order to establish fact. But a grand jury denied that to happen when last week, on the eve of Thanksgiving, they chose not, just like yesterday with Eric Garner, they chose not to indict the police officer and send the case to trial to establish or determine the facts of what happened and if the police officer was guilty of a crime. I'm trying to elaborate a context, which might be a subtext, or perhaps the main text, in which we are talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer this morning. In the wake of the Michael Brown events, a meme started circulating in social media, which then caught fire in the broader media. Black Lives Matter. But the ghosts that visit us this morning, the ghosts of Eric Garner, the ghosts of Michael Brown, the ghosts of Tamir Rice, that 12-year-old boy playing in the park with a toy gun who was shot by police in Cleveland, the ghost of Rhanisha McBride, who also earlier this year was shot in Detroit as she knocked on a neighbor's door as she sought help because she had car trouble. The ghost of Trayvon Martin last year, walking, wearing a hoodie, going to the store to get some Skittles. These ghosts suggest something. What if within the frame of the US nation state, Black lives don't matter? I mean, I'm sort of saying that I don't like that meme because I think that meme, Black Lives Matter, is a non sequitur within the framework of the modern US nation state. What if within the frame of the US nation state, Black lives can only register as the state's antimatter? And that as antimatter, and this is where the study, parenthetically, I insert the study of physics, particle physics on the one hand, and that literary genre called science fiction on the other, might help us understand something about the crisis of race that we have been in. The meeting of antimatter and matter yields an explosive reaction that threatens the order of matter. And thus, understood from the vantage point of antimatter, vantage point of matter, antimatter is viewed as pathogenic, as threat to the matter, to life matter. Thus, blackness, if understood within this analogy as antimatter, it doesn't matter. Thus, blackness gets viewed as in need of regulation in order for its society to be defended and protected. Here I'm inflecting Michel Foucault. And so we're not in a moment in which Black lives matter. We're in a moment, a long moment, in which Black lives don't and haven't mattered. We're in a moment, a long moment, a moment that extends to the slave ship Zong, into slave ships before the Zong in 1781. We're in a moment that extends back to the dispossession of Native and First Nations peoples. We're in a moment, a long moment that stretches back to plantations in the Caribbean, plantations in North America, plantations in Peru and Brazil and beyond that. We're in a moment, a long moment, when 13 British colonies decided to break away and become a settler colonial nation and to embark on a project of continental expansion and possession through dispossession that we now look back and write in terms of manifest destiny, that yielded the United States of America, the United States of American exceptionalism, which is the performance of a violent imperialism that tries to hide its hand. We're in this long moment. We must understand Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Rhanisha McBride, Tamir, the young boy that was killed in Cleveland, and the many, many others that I haven't even named. We must understand them in that moment. We're in this long moment in which Black lives don't matter. Which is to say, Black lives matter only as antimatter. Friends, I'm pointing to a systemic and structural problem. Du Bois called it the problem of the color line that belts the planet. As structural, it is an optical regime, a regime of visuality. And through the optical regime of the visual, work is carried out to stabilize an inherently unstable, indeed incoherent, and I will argue unsustainable way of orchestrating and arranging life. What's targeted in the regime of the optical, in effect, is the effort to stabilize a creaking system, a creaking apparatus linked up to bodies. What's targeted is body parts in the name of stabilizing or attempting to render coherent, because it's inherently incoherent. That is to say, the attempt to normalize a body politic. At stake in the regulation of bodies is the stability or not of the body politic. Matter, quote unquote, is targeted in such a way as to split off the abnormal from the normal, antimatter from threatening matter, or what matters. Proper bodies, the proper body politic, from improper bodies, let's just call that the flesh. Splitting off the threatening, questionable citizen, or maybe even, and here I'm thinking about the immigrant crisis, which is happening in the midst of all this, the non-citizen from the proper citizen. Through logics of bordering, we got to protect the border. In short, the optical regime targets the properly human to protect it from what we might call the animalic, the savage, the inhuman, the less than human, the not quite human, the infrahuman others. Frantz Fanon, the Martinican intellectual, was getting at precisely what I'm talking about with his 1952 book. Bear in mind, 1952 is just a few short years after Bonhoeffer's own death, 1945. That book that Fanon called Black Skin, White Masks. This book was an analysis of precisely the operations of visuality. The operations that I'm talking about, as those operations targeted what he called black skin. Remember that famous phrase of that book, given in the famous chapter of that book. The phrase is, "Look, a Negro." The chapter is called "The Lived Experience of the Black." And the white masks part of the title speaks to the futility, this is Fanon's point, speaks to the futility of black folks trying to acquire standing. I'm going to come back to this question of standing, because actually it bears right upon Bonhoeffer. Black folks trying to acquire standing within such a systemic relationship or arrangement. In other words, and I'll have this here, Fanon is trying to get after the problematic of what happens when black folk try and lay claim to wanting standing inside an arrangement that only gives them standing in their death. You stand when you outlined on the ground. So Fanon is asking a question, what does it even mean to want standing in that? What do I mean by acquiring standing? With this, I am pointing to the futility that Fanon suggests to try to comport oneself to the order of things and to petition the states to recognize your proper humanness, your proper citizenship, your human rights. For at best, you'll always, and this is Fanon's point, at best, you'll always be just wearing a mask before the state and never be seen as the genuine article. And because not genuinely white in this regard, also subject to the possibility of being seen at any instant as antimatter, which is to say, as threat to the state, as threat to the order of things. See, my beef with this Black Lives Matter is one way to hear it. Not everybody deploys it this way, but too many people do. One way to hear it is that it's a petition for standing before the state. And like, you don't get it. Blackness only gets seen, only gets constituted as extractable labor, and at that, and with that, for death. This leads Fanon to his 1961 text, The Wretched of the Earth, Homo damnatus. It's another way to talk about the wretched, the figure of the damned, which dares us, this text, which dares us to imagine a new way of life together. Remember that nice Bonhoeffer text, Life Together? You already see what I'm going to start to get at with Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer started to see something. And I wanted to understand the conditions by which he saw the need for a new imagination of life together, and by which he understood Christianity as bound up with an imagination of life together, not according to the terms in his context of the Aryan state. This leads Fanon to his 1961 text, The Wretched of the Earth, which dares us to imagine a new way of life together. Life beyond the vision of the human, that within the frame of the state is always split within itself. Within the frame of the state, the vision of the human, the vision of the citizen subject is always split between the proper and the improper, as predicated on the normality of property, right? Remember when all the protests were breaking off? Everybody forgot about Michael Brown dead in the street. They talking about property damage. That stuff is bound up with the split between the properly human and the improper human. Proper humanness is bound up with property. So the destruction of property gets inflected as a part of the abnormal, which is to say it's another manifestation of why we got to kill Mike Brown. I'm trying to hold it together. My wife told me not to get too excited. I'm going to try and finish this sentence. This leads Fanon to his 1961 text, The Wretched of the Earth, which dares us to imagine a new way of life together, beyond the vision of the human that can only think in the matter-antimatter divide, in the human less than human divide, or in the split between the properly saintly and the wretched or the demonic, which is the very language you will recall last week that Darren Wilson used to describe Michael Brown. He said, when I look into his eyes, I saw a demon. I didn't see a human being. So what does it mean to want standing within a framework of a gaze that works like that? I'll go ahead and telegraph where I'm coming from, because y'all probably can feel it anyway. I don't want standing in that. I want the destruction of it. May thy kingdom come. That's a prayer of destruction, y'all. Both in black skins, white masks, and in the wretched of the earth. Don't worry, I'm gonna get to Fanon, I hope. To Bonhoeffer, I hope. Both in black skin, white masks, and in wretched of the earth. Fanon says that in order to escape this political arrangement, this ontological arrangement, we must reckon with it as a skin in which blackness has no standing. But he also sees that blackness is not reducible to what the state wants to say about it. Blackness is always in excess of that. And the excessiveness comes as an excess even beyond black people, right? Black people don't own blackness because blackness ain't property to be owned in the first place. Blackness is in excess of black people too, which is to say blackness is always already ecumenical. The question isn't whether or not blackness loves black people and non-black people. The question is whether non-black people can love blackness too. I'm gonna say that again because I think some of y'all didn't get that. The question isn't whether or not blackness can love non-black people. It does, it's ecumenical. The question is whether or not non-black people and black people can love blackness too. If the video of Garner's chokehold killing teaches us anything, it does in fact teach us that within the frame of the state, blackness has no standing, or only has standing when it's choked to death. You know, folk running around talking about we need body cameras. I never believed that. We up inside of a problem that ain't no camera gonna fix. What makes you think a camera gonna fix this? They had cameras on Rodney King in 1991. Cameras were never gonna fix this. We're dealing with a structural problematic. We're dealing with a crisis of life together. We're dealing with a crisis in which the technology of living has been turned against life. And you could take pictures of that all day, and all you mean taking pictures of are bodies on the ground. We must understand that that video was in fact telling the truth. The state's truth. Namely, that blackness only acquires standing before the state when it's dead. This is what Professor James Cone has been saying in his Black Theology project now for at least the last 50 years, and most recently in his last book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. But what makes Professor Cone the theological genius that he is, I just got to pause. I had breakfast with Dr. Cone yesterday. Well, this stuff is personal for me. We still haven't caught up with that man understood and yet understands. People running around talking about, still trying to figure out what the Black Theology Project is. I just be shaking my head. I was like, what are you talking about? This thing been around for 50 years. In 1968, when he started writing, he was looking down the corridors of time and he was already telling us about Michael Brown and giving it to us in a theological idiom for the church. What makes Cone the theological genius that he is? I keep pausing on this because, the book on Cone has not been written. I tried to write a little chapter on him, but that was just me clearing my throat. That wasn't nothing, y'all. I was trying. But it ain't been written yet. What this man was trying to get at, which is why we have not caught up with him yet after his over 50 years of intellectual production on behalf of the church and for the Theological Academy, what makes him the genius that he is is that he grasped, along with the Black Power movement, Amiri Baraka, all them folk, he grasped that the pathology of American racism has been sewn with the threads of the Christian imagination itself. To borrow that phrase of my good friend and colleague and fellow theologian, Willie James Jennings, that there's a problematic theological dimension to race and of race. What I tried to get at in my book must, my friends, must be accounted for. A dimension by which we must study. We must study how race is a certain theological invention that must be interrogated so that the otherwise, the possible, might emerge. This is the problem that must be studied, the problem of political theology as the problem of racial sovereignty. Okay. This is being videotaped, so I'm having to keep myself together. My wife said, don't get up there, sweetie, and curse. So I'm keeping myself together, y'all. It might slip though, so Lord forgive me. Okay. This is the problem of political theology as the problem of racial sovereignty. Cone, with Fanon, understood that Black church life already entailed its own theological response to the problem, the theological problem it was diagnosing. And thus, while Black lives might not matter within the frame of the state, Black life, hear me very clearly here, because this is the thread of hope right inside of the crisis. Black life as analogic to or parabolic of the life of Jesus Christ does matter. I got this distinction I'm working out between Black lives that don't matter, right? That just wants to serially line up. What the state wants to do, it wants to serially line up lives as equal to each other, right? As equivalent to each other, the equivalent same individual, which the sphere of US citizenship makes us all equal before the law, right? And so all those lives serially get lined up as supposedly equal before the law, hiding the fact that lives in their particularity don't have equivalent standing before the law. That's what we're looking at when we look at the Trayvon Martins and the Michael Browns, the Eric Garners. For all of the legal talk of general equality, of legal equality, of abstract equality, when we get down to the particular, what do we see? That those lives are not equal. So if Black lives don't matter because of their inequality before the law, Black life in the singular is something else. Black life indexes a form of sociality, a form of gathering, of social belonging that cannot be accounted for and calibrated within the terms of the state, and in fact is a threat to the state. When Michael Brown is walking down the street with his friend, that form of sociality is a threat. When Eric Garner on that videotape is standing there about to be chokeholded, and he says, "Why do y'all keep messing with me?" You can hear somebody in the background saying, "He didn't do anything. He just broke up a fight." There was a form of living that was already happening. Right? That when the state in the form of the police show up, they see as a threat. You selling cigarettes. I'm not selling no cigarettes. What are you talking about? And then he finally says, "No, I'm not going." He says to them, "No." This voice of protest indexes a form of life that preceded the showing up of the cops in the first place. We got to think that excess, which the state tries to narrate as criminality.
The state only knows how to index that as the life of crime. And what it does is it offers up that narrative to us for us to believe, which is to say, exercise an act of faith that we, the state, know the narrative. Because we, the state, we the ones that function as God. Cone with Fanon understood that black church life already entailed its own theological response to this theological problem. And thus, while black lives might not matter, black lives within the index of the state might not matter, black life, black social life, black gathering, black holding on, black making a way out of no way, as analogic to and parabolic of the life of Jesus Christ, does matter. But here's the kicker, y'all. I don't have y'all, I do have kicker. Black life, the singular, social life, black life matters as life of a different order. It matters in such a way that can only be seen, though, as disorder, as foolishness, before the God that is the state and its regulatory practices of state racism. A buddy of mine sort of broke it down like this. He said it's sort of like, if you want to understand black life, it's sort of like you, it's funny to invoke, and not so funny to invoke this in light of the Bill Cosby scandals that are happening right now. But I was a little kid, and my mom used to cut on the Fat Albert show. And this was before, you had, HD TV and high definition. We used to get up and, there was no remote control, we had to get up and turn it. And we had an old TV, and the knob was broke. So we had to use pliers to get up it. Y'all don't know what I'm talking about. Some of y'all don't. We had to use pliers to turn the channel. So my mama used to get up. I was a little kid trying to figure out what pliers had to do with the TV. My mama used to get up with the pliers and turn the ABC. And we had to turn it so much, she had worn down the little piece up in there so you couldn't grab it. She had to turn the ABC, and Fat Albert show was on. And you remember they had that band, the cartoon players, they had a band that used to strum with boxes and all kind of junk, right? They used to make sound out of nothingness, out of junk. And one of the dudes, I forget his name, but he used to wear this funny hat on his head. He was the guitarist. And he would strum on this cereal box, I think it was, with this little stick coming out of it. And he used to strum, and he used to make music out of junkyard nothingness. But you remember when he played the music, he would always hold his head down and do it like this. And so the music was an affirmation of another form of life, at the same time that the head was a kind of negation to the order of things. So the music of blackness is the music of another possibility, even as in the sound of the possible, there's the negating affirmation against the order of things. That's called the general insurrection, which is a resurrection. That's what I'm after. When Bonhoeffer comes to Harlem, Bonhoeffer encounters that. So I'm gonna start to make my move now a little bit on Bonhoeffer. I've taken this path into Bonhoeffer because, as I said earlier, there are two reasons, or two things we must keep in mind today, this day. Was it December 4th, 2014, a day after the non-indictment of these police officers? We cannot step up in here and talk about Bonhoeffer as if that ain't happening. The first thing we got to keep in mind, which I've been elaborating on, is that our country is and has been in the midst of a crisis of racialization. And it's a crisis of racialization that is bound up with Christianity too. Christianity is not apart from this. The crisis that I'm talking about is a crisis of the political. We must understand the crisis of race, not simply the way we typically think about it. The crisis of race is the crisis of the political. It's the crisis of how race matters. If I can play with Cornel West now. This crisis has been exacerbated under that new cultural formation that we call the post-racial. The post-racial is not the overcoming of race. And as many of us celebrated the election of Barack Obama, we celebrated it under the cloud of the post-racial. We saw it as the harbinger of a possibility that we finally have overcome race. A black man in the White House, something new is happening. And people started talking about this post-racial moment. But what's become clear almost from day one, matter of fact, before day one, because he couldn't get in office without already having to deal with race, Jeremiah Wright. What we learned from day one is that the post in post-racial is not the overcoming of race, it's afterlife. The post in post-racism, of post-racialism, is the afterlife of race, functioning under our kind of disavowal of its very name. And it's the disavowal that creates the conditions for its exacerbating violence. And if we ain't seen nothing, this is what we've seen over the last 8 years. This crisis has been exacerbated under conditions of that new cultural formation that has come to be called the post-racial, which follows upon that declared post-civil rights era of the 1990s. There's a line from the post-civil rights era declaration of the 1990s to the post-racial era, and the increase of racial violence thereafter. We engage Bonhoeffer the day after massive riots, the day after an uprising. What happened in New York City last night, let's not get it twisted, that was an uprising. That was an insurrection. What happened after Ferguson, that non-indictment last week, that was an uprising. That was an insurrection. We engaged Bonhoeffer the day after massive riots last night in New York City, and a week after uprisings in Ferguson and around the country last week. We engaged Bonhoeffer in the wake of Tamir Rice and Rainisha McBride. And therefore, this is the second thing we got to keep in mind when we try to talk about Bonhoeffer's significance. We engage Bonhoeffer in the wake, which is to say, not just the wake of those particular people, but in a wake, which is to say, at a death scene, a funeral wake, at the scene of death through regulation in the name of the state. That's to say, we don't just engage Bonhoeffer in the wake of these deaths, I engage him to assist me to do some wake work. Theology as wake work. The work of disinterring the dead. Because these dead ain't quite dead. The saints never die. I seek to be their muse, muse of the dead, their conjurers. Do work that resurrects their voices in the name of a general insurrection against false gods that seek to secure themselves through the death of others. Can there be an imagination of life that is not predicated on the need to kill that which is perceived as a threat? Can there be an imagination of life that does not need death as its antithesis? Such is the work. Such work is theological wake work. The literary theorist Christina Sharp might say. I prefer to call it theological life work, the work of Black church life, what black church life at its best has been about since its first inceptions, its first moments. And those first moments weren't just the founding of the institutional black church expressions in the 19th century, but I'm talking about black church life since the hold of slave ships. You want to understand where black church comes from, you got to think inside the slave ship. There was life in the hold. Even if it could only be registered as fantastic life, the life of a black fantastic. There was fantasy in the hold, blackness in the hold. No, not blackness, paratheological blackness in the hold. We attend to Bonhoeffer because he, I want to suggest to you, had an encounter with this black fantastic, with the black church fantastic. And that encounter indexes what I call Bonhoeffer's blackness. I can't believe this. My time. My time. Oh my goodness. Can I be given 5 minutes? And then, okay. And I'll pick some of this up then at the meeting this evening. I think there's a meeting at the church.
At 1 o'clock in Hafer Center.
Okay.
And 7 o'clock at this evening.
Yeah.
Next meeting will be 1 o'clock in Hafer.
7 o'clock is at Holy Trinity Lutheran.
Okay. So what I think I'll do then is I'll give maybe just a little tidbit of what I mean by Bonhoeffer's blackness and Bonhoeffer's failed blackness. Be very schematic. I mean, extremely condensed. And then we'll use the occasion of the 1 o'clock time along with the occasion of 7 o'clock to sort of elaborate it some more. What I mean by Bonhoeffer's blackness is that when Bonhoeffer goes to New York City, and I believe it is 1929, as a fellow, he gets a fellowship from Germany, the German government in effect, to come and study abroad for 1 year. He comes to New York City and is a student at Union Theological Seminary and Columbia University. He takes a series of courses there. He's in Manhattan. He uses his evenings, mainly Wednesday night evenings, to go to church and weekends to go to church. And there he crosses, as it were, the color line, which in New York City is a kind of class divide line, which is also a racial divide line between Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, and Harlem. Bonhoeffer goes across the tracks, as it were, and visits black life in Harlem, and specifically goes to the church, the Abyssinian Baptist Church. At Abyssinian, he engages another expression, as it were, of Christian life as black life, which has a deep effect on him. And there are a lot of people who are starting to write on this, or I shouldn't say a lot, but it's starting to get traction, this dimension of Bonhoeffer's life. My good friend, Reggie Williams, has written a book on this recently. And as I said, Reggie is good friends of mine, and in many ways, I took the reading that Reggie gives in that book, but I have to confess, I've migrated from that reading. I actually think that that moment was very complex. I think that when Bonhoeffer went to Harlem, he had the attitude and the idea and the mindset of a bourgeois German white man, which is to say he went to Harlem functioning sort of like an anthropologist looking at these museum primitive artifacts on the order of a Picasso, mobilizing the primitive to think through the Western. Bonhoeffer was doing this too, but he got more than he bargained for, because what he encountered could not be collapsed into sheer primitivity. And it's at that moment that Bonhoeffer not so much gets the point of the black church, gets the point of blackness. He embarks upon a journey in which blackness and black church life and black social life is always ahead of him. He's trying to catch up with what is always in excess of him. And that catch-up affects him when he goes back to Germany. He has new eyes to see the Jewish problem as a deep kind of social problem. And he keeps the experience of Harlem in the back of his mind. It's working on him, right? Leading him ultimately to found a seminary, which was an illegal institution. He founds an illegal seminary, which is to say, as a professor in theological education, he was functioning criminally. Now, that's something to get your head around. How many of us function in theological seminary as professors, as criminal professors, breaking the law of the state? To say nothing of students who come as criminal students. This is Bonhoeffer's being led in a certain way into how blackness has a different relationship to the state, precisely because it has a different outlook on what it means to have life together, to live together, to be together. And Bonhoeffer writes two critical books that start to get at this: Discipleship and Life Together, written in this institutional moment of Finkenwalde, this illegal fugitive seminary. Discipleship is one of the most radical books that was ever written. And it's always befuddled me how people gravitate toward it. It's one of the most radical books you will ever read. It is it's on the cusp of being one of the most radical critiques of the state you will ever come across. Even as it's a critique of Arianism, which we might call white normativity, right? As the practice of statecraft and citizenship. Bonhoeffer comes against this. He says that baptism breaks that Gordian knot. It cuts the cord. It severs your relationship to those in who you claim to belong to, me and my people. It breaks the cord by which, a certain kind of Aryan communalism works over against a Jewish outside. It cuts that cord and then sutures you to Jesus Christ, such that now all relationships are mediated through Jesus. And in this, you can read this as a profound critique of the logic of the citizen. And then he writes Life Together, which again is another Christological reimagining of community beyond that form of community that the state offers up to us, and even mobilizes religious language, such as Christianity, to back itself up. Bonhoeffer is following the call of blackness. But yet, by the time he gets to a book such as this, Ethics, 1939, that vision is coming apart. If Discipleship is one of the most radical books you'll come across, this book, Ethics, for reasons that I had hoped to get into in more detail, is one of the most problematic books you'll come across. We see the failed blackness in this book. The reason this book is so problematic is because if America wants to talk about American exceptionalism, Bonhoeffer is a little bit more ecumenical about it. He wants to talk about what I might call Western exceptionalism. And how Western exceptionalism turns out, when everything is said and done, to be a practice of the empire. This book is an imperial theology book. One of the things I'm writing is to make that case, because I know I said it strong and I actually mean it stronger than what I said. But then finally, by the time Bonhoeffer gets to the end of his life, and I mean the very end, about 6 months before he is to be executed, once the goods are gotten on him that he really was involved in a conspiracy to bring down Hitler, about 6 months before, the summer before, summer 1944, Bonhoeffer starts writing poetry. And in that poetry, you can see him circling back. You can hear the echo still of a blackness that he's trying to catch up with. And he starts to interrogate, not the question, how do I appreciate the other? Which is the question we're locked inside of still. How can I appreciate the other? That no longer is the question for Bonhoeffer. The question for Bonhoeffer in German is, wer bin ich? Who am I? Which is to say, not how do I appreciate the other, how do I understand my own production as a German, European, white Christian? who believes from that standpoint, I have a vantage point on the rest of the world. Bonhoeffer puts that under the microscope, his own formation. In other words, my friends, and this is going to be my last statement, the problem for Bonhoeffer by the time he gets to the end is not the problem of difference. The problem for Bonhoeffer by the time he gets to the end of the life is himself. The formation and constitution of the Bonhoefferian I, which turns out to be a kind of nodal point, a symbolic moment of the constitution of the Western I, Western man, who in its racial formation is capital W, capital M, the white man, as that which regulates the planet and determines what the human means. Bonhoeffer's theological work came to understand that the two doctrinal sites where all of that was working was theological anthropology on the one hand and Christology on the other. This is why when you read his work, you can see him constantly coming back to these doctrines, attempting to disentangle them from the structures of the I of Western man that purports to be a Christian I. Okay, I'll shut up there. I'll stop there. Thank you.